Recently, an amateur astronomer detected an unusually bright spot in the data from the SOHO solar probe, which turned out to be a completely unknown comet named C/2025 F2 Swan. Experts and amateur space explorers alike hoped that the icy chunk would treat us to a spectacular show in the sky that we could all marvel at with the naked eye. Unfortunately, however, experts have now announced some bad news about Swan. But what happened to the comet? Today, we'll show you exactly how the celestial body was discovered, why comets hold such enormous potential for knowledge, and what fate has befallen Swan. When our ancestors saw a comet in the sky thousands of years ago, it was usually not a good sign. After all, a certain Aristotle interpreted the peculiar tail stars as vapors from swamps, which were considered a bad omen. But even in the centuries that followed, these brilliant celestial events were often seen as cosmic harbingers of doom. They were suspected of overthrowing kings, bringing down powerful empires, and causing devastating famines and epidemics. And indeed, the negative view of comets was by no means limited to the distant, unenlightened past. Even in the age of telescopes and modern astronomy, shady businessmen made a fortune from the chunks of space debris by peddling a dubious cure for the comet fever, which was supposedly brought to Earth in 1910 by the toxic gas tail of Halley's Comet. Even more tragic, however, were the events set in motion by the Hale-Bopp comet in 1997. Members of the Heaven's Gate cult were convinced that it was the long-awaited spaceship that would take them to the kingdom of heaven. 39 cult members believed that they had to sever all ties to their earthly lives, which is why they collectively ended them. Apart from these sad incidents, however, the former comet scare has long since given way to astronomical enlightenment. According to this, we are simply dealing with small celestial bodies in the solar system that are best known for their characteristic appearance and special composition. And although comets resemble asteroids with their rocky surface and size of up to a few dozen kilometers, they consist mainly of water ice, dust, and frozen gases. Unlike asteroids, comets are mainly found in the outer solar system, where they swarm in large numbers far away from the planets and the sun, in the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud. Basically, these frosty chunks travel through space on highly elliptical orbits, which means that they usually move slowly and far away from our central star. However, in the inner part of their orbit, comets come very close to the sun for a short time and pass it at high speed. And as long as these celestial bodies remain in the regions of the outer planets or at a great distance from the sun, their weakly reflective surface makes them some of the darkest objects in our home system. However, as soon as they enter the region of the inner planets, this characteristic is dramatically reversed. The sun's rays cause the gases bound in the comet to evaporate, creating a diffused shell of gas and dust around the nucleus, which experts refer to as the coma. At the same time, the comet also acquires what makes it a comet in the eyes of the general public. When the coma is blown away by the solar wind, it forms a tail pointing away from the sun, which can be several million kilometers long and shines brightly in the reflected light of our parent star. How Swan was discovered. However, comets are not only the focus of astronomical interest because of their breathtaking light shows, but above all because they are considered to be the oldest, largely unchanged remnants of the solar system. In fact, these objects date back to around 4.5 billion years ago, when our home system emerged from a colossal dust disk. So, we're dealing with tangible relics of the first matter of our cosmic home. But that's not all. Some scientists believe that comets may have been responsible for turning Earth into the water-rich, life-friendly planet it is today. Evidence has already been found to suggest that the water in Earth's primordial oceans, and perhaps even the first building blocks of life, may have literally fallen from the sky. Given this, there is no question that comet research appears to be worthwhile, to say the least. But how do you track down these chunks of rock in the first place? Well, comets are usually detected by professional surveys, in which automatic systems scan the sky for moving objects. However, amateur space researchers have also proven to be successful comet hunters, as was the case in 2023, when a Japanese amateur astronomer accidentally discovered Comet Nishimura in photos taken with his normal SLR camera. The discovery of Comet C/2025 F2 Swan was also not made by a professional scientist, but by Australian amateur astronomer Michael Madiazzo, who had been examining publicly available data from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, SOHO, at the end of March. For the sake of completeness, it should be mentioned that in addition to Madiazzo, Vladimir Bazugli and Rob Matson also independently noticed the previously unknown object. And this despite the fact that SOHO's main task is not actually to add new comets to the star charts. Jointly operated by ESA and NASA and in service for almost 30 years, the Space Observatory primarily observes the Sun. At the same time, its UV camera solar wind anisotropies, SWAN, is also capable of imaging comets. As soon as the ice on the comet's surface sublimates, the ionized hydrogen released in the process emits ultraviolet radiation, which then appears as a bright spot in the SWAN instrument. And it was precisely such a bright point of light moving across the camera's field of view during a series of exposures that Madiazzo and Bazugli found on March 29th. Robert Matson reported the discovery 2 days later. However, official confirmation was initially slow in coming. Madiazzo commented, "I couldn't verify the comet because it's not visible from my location." Fortunately, comet hunters are a close-knit and resourceful community. After the discovery had made the rounds among other amateur astronomers, it didn't take long before the first images of the object taken from Earth were published. Analysis of observatory images then showed that SWAN had actually crept into our field of vision much earlier. After all, it was already visible in images taken by Xingming Pan-STARRS and the Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory, some of which dated back to September 2024. A brief comet delight. Edmund Halley, who discovered and named Halley's Comet, was convinced over 300 years ago that a chunk of sky had even made it into the Bible. According to the English polymath, the Star of Bethlehem was nothing more than a comet. Based on what we know today, Halley was wrong in his assessment, but the fascination with comets remains. This is especially true for those objects that are officially classified as great comets. Unfortunately, there is no generally accepted definition that determines when a celestial body qualifies as such. However, the rule of thumb is that this is the case when the comet is visible to even an inexperienced observer in the night sky. To do so, the comet must reach an apparent brightness equivalent to that of the 22 brightest stars, or a value of 1.5 mag. This includes Halley's Comet, which has been visiting us every 74 to 79 years since 240 BC. In the more recent past, an object called a Kia Seiki made headlines when it broke into 2 pieces in October 1965 and became the brightest comet of the 20th century, with an apparent brightness of -10 mag. Hale-Bopp, briefly mentioned earlier, is considered the most observed and photographed comet of the 20th century. With its 2 tails, it was visible to the naked eye for a full 18 months, longer than any other comet. The fate of Swan. But what is the situation with Swan? Will this chunk of ice treat us to a similarly dazzling spectacle in the sky? Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it. But let's take it one step at a time. At the time of its discovery, Swan appeared as a small greenish point of light in the morning sky shortly before sunrise. However, it was not visible to the naked eye, only with the aid of binoculars or a small telescope. With the necessary equipment, the greenish gas envelope and the faint tail of a comet could be clearly seen in the constellation Pegasus. And if everything had gone well in the following days, Swan would probably have been visible to the naked eye in early May. But unfortunately, the behavior of comets is very difficult to predict. Experts had expected Swan to make its closest approach to the Sun on May 1st, but we can never know in advance whether a chunk of ice will survive such an encounter unscathed. And unfortunately, Swan apparently did not succeed in doing so. Observers recently reported in an astronomy forum that they can no longer see the comet's long tail. Its brightness is also not increasing any further, which unfortunately means that Swan appears to be disintegrating. The chance of admiring the comet in the sky with the naked eye, it may seem to have vanished, which is a shame, to say the least. The fact that the comet could be observed with binoculars and telescopes was an absolutely unique event. Swan's orbital period around the Sun is a whopping 2.1 million years, which means it would not have returned to our field of vision for many hundreds of thousands of years. But it was simply not meant to be. And yet, we should not mourn the loss of this comet. Who knows? Perhaps the next comet discovery is just an attentive amateur astronomer away, and with it, the chance of a breathtaking sight that no observer will ever forget. And now you have the chance to get a breathtaking click that will ensure you never forget to subscribe again. Simply press the thumbnail and the subscribe button to stay up to date from now on. We'll see you soon.